The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Ashford mansion in Richmond, Virginia, casting delicate shadows across the parlor's Persian rugs. Outside, the humid August air already pressed against the windows, promising another sweltering day in 1903. Inside, servants moved with practiced silence, preparing the main room for something unusual, a portrait session that would include not just the family, but their help as well. Margaret Hayes stood near the window, adjusting the cameo brooch at her collar. At 42 years old, she had spent the last 18 years of her life caring for the Ashford children, watching 3 generations grow under this roof. Her dark skin gleamed in the morning light, and her hands, worn from years of labor but still graceful, smoothed down the stiff fabric of her best Sunday dress. The dress was modest, high-necked and long-sleeved despite the heat, in the deep navy blue that was expected of domestic staff even on special occasions. But today, Margaret wore something else. Something she never displayed during her daily duties. Around her neck hung a delicate gold necklace, thin as a thread, with a small locket that caught the light each time she moved. The locket was old, older than her position in this house, older than her freedom. Inside it held a secret she had protected for 38 years. "Margaret, please position yourself here behind Mrs. Ashford's chair," the photographer called out, gesturing to a spot that would place her in the background of the composition. Harold Thornton was a portly man with a thick mustache, newly arrived from Philadelphia to photograph Richmond's most prominent families. He saw nothing unusual in the arrangement. The help were often included in family portraits, standing in the periphery like living furniture, proof of a household's prosperity and order. Catherine Ashford, the lady of the house, settled into her chair with practiced elegance. She was a thin woman of 50, with silver threading through her brown hair despite her attempts to disguise it. Her silk dress rustled as she arranged its folds, and diamonds glittered at her ears and throat. To her right stood her husband, Edmund Ashford, a railroad attorney whose success had built this mansion and everything in it. His face carried the stern expression of a man accustomed to authority, though age had softened his jawline and brought a slight stoop to his shoulders. The Ashford children, though hardly children anymore, arranged themselves according to the photographer's instructions. Thomas, the eldest at 28, stood tall beside his father, already dressed in the dark suit and stiff collar that marked him as a serious young attorney following in Edmund's footsteps. Elizabeth, 25 and recently engaged, wore a cream-colored dress with pearl buttons running down the bodice. She kept glancing at her mother, seeking approval for her posture and expression. The youngest, James, barely 21, shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the formality of the occasion. Margaret took her assigned position, standing slightly behind and to the left of Catherine Ashford's chair. From here, she would be visible but secondary, present but not prominent, exactly as social order dictated in Richmond in 1903. The photographer had positioned the other servants along the edges of the frame. Samuel, the butler, stood near the doorway. Mary and Ruth, the housemaids, flanked the opposite side. But Margaret's position was different. She stood closer to the family, her hand resting gently on the back of Catherine's chair in a gesture that spoke of years of intimate service. "Everyone remain perfectly still," Thornton instructed, disappearing beneath the black cloth of his camera. "The exposure will take several seconds. Do not move, do not blink, and please," he paused for emphasis, "maintain a pleasant expression." In that moment of stillness, Margaret's mind drifted. The necklace felt heavier than usual against her skin, warm from her body heat. She thought of the last time she had worn it openly, 38 years ago in Charleston, when she was still called by another name and belonged to another family. The weight of memory pressed down on her shoulders like invisible hands. But she smiled. Years of service had taught her the value of a smile, how it could smooth over awkwardness, diffuse tension, make white people comfortable in her presence. So she smiled for the portrait, her expression serene and gracious, giving no hint of the story that lived beneath her calm exterior. The camera's shutter clicked. The moment was captured. In that fraction of time, preserved forever on the glass plate negative, Margaret Hayes existed as she appeared to the world. A faithful servant, a beloved nanny, a woman content with her place in the social order of the New South. But the necklace told a different story, one that began decades before in a world that was both intimately close and impossibly distant from this elegant parlor in Richmond. "Excellent," Thornton declared, emerging from beneath his cloth. "Now, I'd like to take individual portraits of the family members. The servants may return to their duties." Margaret nodded and turned to leave, but Catherine's voice stopped her. "Margaret, please stay. I'd like you in the family portraits as well." There was something in Catherine's tone, not quite warmth, but not coldness either. Perhaps obligation or habit, or the peculiar intimacy that developed between white women and the black women who raised their children. Edmund Ashford frowned slightly but said nothing. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Elizabeth studied her gloves. Only young James met Margaret's eyes, offering a small, genuine smile. Of all the Ashford children, he had always been the kindest, the one who still remembered the stories she used to tell him at bedtime, who thanked her for small kindnesses that the others took for granted. The photographer began arranging the family for the next composition, and Margaret stood where she was told, always where she was told. The parlor had grown warmer as the morning progressed, and sweat gathered beneath her collar. The necklace seemed to burn against her skin, a small circle of metal carrying the weight of everything she had never said aloud in this house. "Margaret raised all 3 of our children," Catherine explained to the photographer, as if justifying Margaret's continued presence in the frame. "She's been with us since Thomas was 10 years old. She's practically family." Practically. The word hung in the air like smoke. Margaret had heard it before, many times, always accompanied by gestures of conditional affection, gifts at Christmas, praise for her cooking, permission to attend colored church on Sundays. Practically family, but not family. Practically free, but never quite free. Practically safe, but always one misstep away from disaster. The photographer nodded, understanding the social calculation without needing further explanation. In 1903 Richmond, in the former capital of the Confederacy, everyone understood the unspoken rules that governed interactions between the races. The old slavery was gone, destroyed by war and Lincoln's proclamation, but new systems had emerged to take its place. Laws that kept black people separate, customs that kept them subordinate, violence that kept them afraid. Margaret had navigated these systems for nearly 4 decades, ever since that terrible day in Charleston when everything changed. She had learned to read white faces the way sailors read the sky, detecting storms before they broke. She had learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to smile and when to make herself invisible. She had learned to survive. But the necklace remembered a different Margaret, a younger woman with a different name, who had loved and been loved, who had dreamed of possibilities that didn't include standing behind white people in their family portraits, smiling on command. The second photograph took longer to arrange. Thornton wanted the light just right, the composition balanced, everyone positioned to maximum effect. Margaret's legs began to ache from standing so still, but she didn't shift her weight or complain. Discomfort was part of the job, had always been part of the job, whether in slavery or in freedom. Finally, the shutter clicked again. Another moment captured, another image frozen in time. When it was developed and printed, the photograph would hang in the Ashfords' drawing room, proof of their prosperity and their benevolence, showing how well they treated their servants, how Margaret had become practically family. "You may go now, Margaret," Catherine said, dismissing her with a gentle wave. "Please tell cook to prepare luncheon for 2 o'clock. The photographer will be joining us." Margaret curtsied slightly, another learned gesture, performed automatically, and left the parlor. In the hallway, away from the family's eyes, she allowed herself to touch the necklace, her fingers finding the small locket and pressing it against her skin. Inside the locket, yellowed with age, was a tiny photograph and a lock of hair, dark and soft. These were her treasures, her secrets, evidence of a life that existed before Margaret Hayes, before the Ashford house, before everything that came after Charleston. The kitchen was hot and busy when she entered. Cook, a heavy-set woman named Bessie who had worked for the Ashfords almost as long as Margaret, looked up from the stove where she was preparing a roast. "How'd it go? They make you stand in the back like always?" "Close enough to the back," Margaret replied, moving to the sink to wash her hands. "Mrs. Ashford wanted me in the family portraits too." Bessie snorted. "Practically family, I bet," she said. Her exact words. Practically family until one of us steps out of line, then we're just N. She stopped herself, glancing at the doorway where young Samuel stood, the butler's son who helped with heavy work around the house. At 15, he was still learning the careful language required of black servants in white households, still learning which words could be spoken in the kitchen and which had to be swallowed down. Margaret understood Bessie's bitterness. They all felt it, all the servants in the house, the weight of grateful smiles and yes ma'ams, the exhaustion of constant vigilance, the knowledge that their security depended entirely on white approval that could be withdrawn at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. But Margaret also understood something else, something that the necklace reminded her of every day. She understood that survival sometimes meant compromise, that love sometimes meant sacrifice, that the path to freedom was not always straight or clear. These truths lived in the thin gold chain around her neck, in the locket that held her past, in the smile she had given the camera that morning, genuine and false at the same time, real and performed, a truth and a lie existing in the same breath. That evening, after the dinner dishes were washed and put away, after the Ashfords had retired to the drawing room for their nightly ritual of reading and light conversation, Margaret climbed the narrow stairs to her room on the 3rd floor of the mansion. It was a small space, barely larger than a closet, with a single window that looked out over the back garden and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. But it was hers, private and secure, the only space in the house where she could let her guard down completely. She lit the oil lamp on the small table beside her bed and sat down heavily, her body finally acknowledging the fatigue of the day. At 54, she felt the weight of her years more acutely than she once had. Her knees ached when she climbed stairs, her back stiffened after long hours of standing, her hands cramped from the endless tasks that filled her days. But she was still strong, still capable, still necessary to the smooth operation of the Ashford household. Margaret reached behind her neck and unclasped the necklace, holding it up to the lamplight. The gold was tarnished in places, the chain showing signs of age, but it was still beautiful, delicate and finely made, the work of a skilled craftsman. She pressed the tiny clasp on the locket, and it sprang open in her palm. Inside, protected behind a small circle of glass, was a photograph so faded and worn that only she could still make out the features. A young woman, barely 17, with Margaret's eyes and Margaret's smile, held an infant in her arms. The woman wore a simple dress, clean but patched, and her hair was wrapped in a cloth. The baby, perhaps 3 months old, looked directly at the camera with wide, curious eyes. Next to the photograph, secured with a thin ribbon that had long since lost its color, was a lock of hair. Baby hair, soft and fine, dark brown with hints of red when held up to the light. Margaret touched it gently, careful not to disturb it, and closed her eyes. Charleston, 1865. The war was ending, though no one knew it yet in the confusion and chaos of those final months. Margaret, though she was called Sarah then, her birth name, her true name, worked in the house of a merchant family, the Beaumonts, who had owned her since she was 7 years old. The Beaumonts were not the cruelest masters in Charleston, but they were not the kindest either. They fed their slaves adequately, allowed them to attend colored church on Sundays, and rarely used the whip unless they deemed it necessary for discipline. Sarah had been trained as a house servant from childhood, learning to cook and clean and care for the Beaumont children with the efficiency and invisibility that was expected of enslaved domestics. She was 16 when she met Daniel. He belonged to the neighboring plantation, a sprawling rice plantation that stretched for hundreds of acres along the Ashley River. Daniel worked in the blacksmith shop, a skilled tradesman whose master hired him out to neighboring farms and estates. He was 22, tall and strong, with gentle eyes and a quick smile that made Sarah's heart race whenever she saw him. Their courtship, if it could be called that, happened in stolen moments, brief encounters at the market when both were sent on errands, whispered conversations after Sunday services, occasional meetings in the woods between the properties when they could slip away unnoticed. In slavery, even love had to be negotiated in the spaces between white supervision, conducted in secret, always aware that they belonged to different masters and could be separated at any moment. But they fell in love anyway, with the desperate intensity of people who knew their time together might be brief. Daniel talked about freedom, about the Union soldiers who were winning battles in the North, about rumors that Lincoln had declared all slaves free, though their masters insisted these were lies spread by abolitionists to incite rebellion. Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to imagine a life where she and Daniel could be together openly, where they could have children who belonged to themselves rather than to masters who could sell them away. In early 1865, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Joy because the baby was Daniel's, the product of their love, proof that they had created something beautiful despite the ugliness of their circumstances. Terror because pregnant slaves were vulnerable, because she didn't know what the Beaumonts would do, because the war was making everyone nervous and unpredictable. She hid the pregnancy as long as possible, wrapping her growing belly tightly and wearing loose dresses. But eventually, Mrs. Beaumont noticed and called Sarah into her sitting room for a conversation that Sarah would never forget. "You're with child," Mrs. Beaumont said, not as a question but as a statement of observed fact. She was a thin woman with sharp features and sharper eyes, who managed her household with ruthless efficiency. "Who's the father?" Sarah kept her eyes down, her hands clasped in front of her. "Daniel. He belongs to the Thorntons, works in their blacksmith shop." Mrs. Beaumont's expression didn't change. "Does Mr. Thornton know?" "No, ma'am." "Well, he'll have to be told. The child will be mine, of course. We've been wanting another house servant, and training them young is easier." She paused, studying Sarah with the same calculating look she used when inspecting vegetables at the market. "You'll continue your duties until you can't anymore, then you'll rest for 2 weeks after the birth before returning to work. We'll find a wet nurse if needed, or you can feed the child yourself between tasks. Do you understand?" Sarah's heart shattered into pieces, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am." That was how it worked in slavery. Children born to enslaved mothers belonged to the mother's master, regardless of the father's status or wishes. Sarah's baby would be property before it was a person, owned before it was loved, reduced to an economic asset in the Beaumont family's ledger. But 3 weeks later, everything changed. Union soldiers marched into Charleston, and the war ended. The Beaumonts, like all slaveholders in the South, were forced to acknowledge that their human property was no longer theirs to keep. The enslaved people were free, free to leave, free to seek employment elsewhere, free to reunite with separated family members, free to build new lives from the ruins of the old system. The joy of that moment was indescribable. Sarah stood in the Beaumonts' back garden with the other servants, listening as a Union officer read the Emancipation Proclamation, and felt something break open inside her chest. Freedom. The word tasted like honey and burned like whiskey, sweet and fierce and overwhelming. Daniel found her that same day, running down the road from the Thornton property, shouting her name. They held each other in the middle of the road, crying and laughing, making plans for a future that suddenly seemed possible. They would marry, properly, in a church with a real minister who would record their names in a book. They would find work, save money, build a home. Their child would be born free, would grow up free, would never know the weight of chains or the crack of a whip or the terror of the auction block. They married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, surrounded by other formerly enslaved people who were also embracing their new freedom. Sarah became Sarah Jenkins, taking Daniel's surname, claiming an identity that was fully her own for the first time in her life. Their daughter was born in August 1865, in a small room Daniel had rented in the colored section of Charleston. She was perfect, healthy, and strong, with Sarah's eyes and Daniel's chin and a crown of dark hair that seemed determined to curl in every direction. They named her Grace, because that's what she was, a gift of grace in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. For 2 years, they built a life together. Daniel found steady work at a blacksmith shop owned by a freedman who had purchased his own freedom before the war. Sarah took in laundry and did day work for white families, saving every penny she could. They lived frugally, in a tiny house with a leaking roof, but they were together, and they were free, and Grace grew fat and happy on her mother's milk and her parents' love. The necklace had been Daniel's gift to Sarah on their first wedding anniversary. He had saved for months to buy it, spending far more than they could afford, but he insisted. "You deserve something beautiful," he told her, fastening it around her neck. "Something that's yours, that nobody can take away." The locket was empty then, waiting for treasures to fill it. But 1867 brought yellow fever to Charleston. It swept through the colored neighborhoods like fire through dry grass, killing hundreds. Daniel fell sick in September, and despite Sarah's desperate nursing, despite the prayers and the herbal remedies and the doctor who came too late, he died within a week. Grace, barely 2 years old, died 3 days later. Sarah wanted to die too. She wanted to follow her husband and daughter into whatever darkness awaited, wanted to escape the crushing weight of grief that made every breath feel like drowning. But her body betrayed her by continuing to live, continuing to wake each morning, continuing to require food and water and air. The necklace became her lifeline. Before Daniel died, when he was still lucid enough to speak, he took a photograph of Sarah holding baby Grace. A photograph taken by a street photographer shortly after Grace's birth, their one extravagance, their one proof that their little family had existed. "Keep this," he whispered, pressing it into her hand. "Remember we were happy." After they died, Sarah cut a lock of Grace's hair and placed it in the locket alongside the photograph. These became her most precious possessions, her secret evidence that she had once been someone's wife, someone's mother, that she had loved and been loved in return. The grief nearly killed her anyway. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about anything. She drifted through the days like a ghost, haunting the places where her family had lived, unable to move forward or go back. The landlord evicted her when she couldn't pay rent. She lost weight until her clothes hung on her frame like rags on a scarecrow. That's when she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She couldn't be Sarah Jenkins anymore. That woman had died with her family. Sarah Jenkins was a wife and mother, and without Daniel and Grace, those identities had no meaning. So she became someone else. She moved to Richmond, where nobody knew her story, and took the name Margaret Hayes. She found work as a nanny with the Ashford family, who were looking for someone to help with their young children. She never told the Ashfords about Daniel or Grace. She never mentioned Charleston or the life she had lived before coming to Richmond. When they asked about her past, she said simply that she had been freed during the war and had worked as a domestic servant in various households. The Ashfords accepted this explanation without question. The stories of black people in the South were all variations on the same themes, and they saw no reason to inquire deeper. For 18 years, she had been Margaret Hayes, faithful servant, beloved nanny, the woman who smiled for family portraits and never complained and was practically family. She had raised the Ashford children with the same care she had given her own daughter in those brief 2 years, pouring her motherhood into other people's children because it was the only outlet she had for love that had nowhere else to go. But at night, in the privacy of her small room, she opened the locket and became Sarah again. She touched the photograph and the lock of hair and remembered the weight of Grace in her arms, the sound of Daniel's laugh, the brief years when she had been completely herself, completely free, completely loved. The necklace told this story, a story of love and loss, of freedom gained and family destroyed, of a life lived in secret beneath the surface of polite society. When she wore it during the portrait session, it was an act of quiet rebellion, a way of saying, "I existed before this. I loved before this. I was someone other than what you see." Margaret closed the locket and fastened the necklace back around her neck. She would wear it tomorrow too, and every day after, hidden beneath her high collar where only she knew it was there. The Ashfords would never ask about it, would never care to know its story. They would see only what they expected to see, a smiling nanny, content with her place, grateful for their kindness. But Margaret would know the truth. And in a world that tried to reduce her to a single dimension, to a single role, to a single narrative of servitude and gratitude, that knowledge was its own form of freedom. Small, perhaps. Insufficient, certainly. But real. Outside her window, the Richmond night settled over the city, humid and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, carrying passengers to destinations unknown. Margaret lay down on her narrow bed, one hand on the locket, and closed her eyes, letting memory and present collapse into each other, letting Sarah and Margaret exist in the same tired body, the same persistent heart. 3 weeks after the portrait session, The photographs arrived at the Ashford mansion in a large package wrapped in brown paper and twine. Harold Thornton delivered them personally, eager to present his work to one of Richmond's most prominent families and hopeful for future commissions. Catherine Ashford received him in the drawing room, where afternoon light streamed through tall windows overlooking the garden. She carefully removed the wrapping to reveal a series of mounted photographs, each one printed on thick cardstock with the photographer's name embossed in gold at the bottom. Margaret was summoned to view the results along with the rest of the household staff. She stood near the doorway with Bessie, Samuel, and the maids, watching as Catherine examined each photograph with careful attention. Edmund and the children gathered around, offering comments and observations about the composition, the lighting, the way Thornton had captured their expressions. "This one is particularly fine," Catherine announced, holding up the large family portrait, the one that included Margaret. "You've captured us beautifully, Mr. Thornton. The whole family looks distinguished." Margaret studied the photograph from her position near the door. There she was, standing behind Catherine's chair, one hand resting on its back, her expression serene and pleasant. She looked exactly as she had intended to look, professional, composed, unremarkable. The necklace was visible, a thin gold line against her dark neck, the locket resting just below her collar. But it was small enough, subtle enough, that no one would notice it unless they looked closely. Or so she thought. "What's that around Margaret's neck?" Elizabeth Ashford asked suddenly, pointing at the photograph. "I don't remember her wearing jewelry during the session." Catherine leaned closer, squinting slightly. "It appears to be a necklace." "Margaret, what is that?" All eyes turned to Margaret. She felt her heart rate accelerate, felt heat rise in her cheeks, felt the weight of the locket as if it had suddenly grown heavier. "It's just a necklace, ma'am. A small one. I've had it many years." "May I see it?" Catherine's tone was curious rather than accusatory, but Margaret knew that curiosity from white people was rarely innocent. Everything black people owned, everything they claimed as private, was subject to white inspection and judgment. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her collar, where the necklace was hidden beneath the fabric of her work dress. She wanted to refuse, wanted to keep this one thing to herself, wanted to protect the story it carried from white examination. But she had no right to refuse, no real privacy, no genuine autonomy despite the freedom papers she kept folded in her Bible upstairs. She pulled the necklace out from beneath her collar, letting it rest visible against her dress. The locket caught the afternoon light, gleaming gold and delicate. Catherine approached her, extending her hand. "May I?" It wasn't really a question. Margaret lifted the chain over her head and placed it in Catherine's palm, feeling naked without its weight, feeling exposed without its protection. Catherine examined the necklace with the practiced eye of someone who knew jewelry, who could assess the quality and value of precious metals and stones. "This is quite lovely. Real gold, I believe. Where did you get it?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret could feel everyone watching her, the Ashfords, the photographer, the other servants. She chose her words carefully, offering truth without revelation. "It was a gift, ma'am. Many years ago." "From whom?" Elizabeth pressed, leaning over her mother's shoulder to examine the necklace. "From my husband, ma'am." The silence that followed was profound. Bessie's eyes widened. Catherine's expression shifted from curiosity to surprise. Edmund Ashford frowned, clearly uncomfortable with this unexpected disclosure. "Your husband?" Catherine repeated. "Margaret, I didn't know you had been married." "It was before I came to Richmond, ma'am. A long time ago." "What happened to him?" Elizabeth asked, her tone suggesting she had already assumed the answer, that Margaret's husband had left her, or proven unworthy, or met some unfortunate but predictable end. "He died, ma'am. In 1867. Yellow fever in Charleston." Catherine's fingers found the tiny clasp on the locket. Before Margaret could stop her, before she could reclaim her property and her privacy, Catherine opened it. Her expression changed as she saw what was inside, the faded photograph, the lock of baby hair. "There's a child in this picture," Catherine said softly. "Is this you?" Margaret's throat tightened. She had protected this secret for 18 years, had never spoken of it to anyone in Richmond, had kept Sarah and Margaret separate in her mind and heart. But now the walls were crumbling, and she had no choice but to acknowledge what Catherine held in her hands. "Yes, ma'am. That's me with my daughter." "You had a daughter?" Catherine's voice carried genuine surprise, perhaps even a hint of something like hurt, as if Margaret had withheld important information that Catherine, as her employer, deserved to know. "Yes, ma'am. She died when she was 2 years old. Same fever that took my husband." The room fell silent again. Even Elizabeth, usually quick with observations and questions, seemed at a loss for words. Margaret stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes downcast, presenting the image of humble acceptance that was expected of black servants when revealing private pain to white people. Catherine closed the locket carefully and held it out to Margaret. "I'm very sorry for your losses. You've never mentioned this before." "No, it was a long time ago." Margaret took the necklace and fastened it back around her neck, tucking it quickly beneath her collar where it belonged, where it was safe from further inspection. But the damage was done. The secret was out. The wall she had built between Sarah and Margaret had been breached. That evening, after the photographer had left and the family had finished dinner, Catherine called Margaret into her private sitting room. It was a smaller, more intimate space than the drawing room, filled with Catherine's personal belongings, books, photographs, needlework projects in various stages of completion. Catherine gestured to a chair near the window. "Please, sit down, Margaret." Margaret sat, uncomfortable with the informality. In 18 years, she had never been invited to sit in Catherine's presence unless she was ill or injured. Servants stood when speaking to their employers. It was one of the unwritten rules that governed their interactions. Catherine settled into her own chair, arranging her skirts with practiced grace. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply studying Margaret with an expression that seemed equal parts curiosity and calculation. "You've been with us a very long time," Catherine began finally. "You've cared for my children since they were young. Thomas especially, you were like a mother to him when he was a boy. I've always been grateful for your service, your dedication to this family." Margaret nodded, waiting for whatever was coming. She had learned to read Catherine's moods, to detect the subtle shifts in tone that preceded requests or criticisms. "But I realize now that I know very little about you," Catherine continued. "About your life before you came to us, about your experiences during the war and after. About your husband and daughter." She paused, smoothing her skirt. "I'd like to know more if you're willing to share." This was dangerous territory. White people's curiosity about black people's lives was often invasive, often motivated by a desire to collect stories they could share with other white people as entertainment or proof of their own benevolence. Margaret had seen it before. White women who interrogated their servants about their past traumas, who extracted stories of suffering and survival, who then retold these stories at dinner parties as evidence of their own compassionate interest in the Negro question. But refusing Catherine's request was equally dangerous. It would suggest that Margaret had something to hide, that she didn't trust her employer, that she was ungrateful for years of fair treatment. In 1903 Richmond, black people who appeared secretive or distrustful made white people nervous, and nervous white people were dangerous. So Margaret told her story, a carefully edited version, stripped of its most painful details, shaped into a narrative that would satisfy Catherine's curiosity without revealing too much vulnerability. She spoke about being enslaved in Charleston, about meeting Daniel, about gaining freedom at the war's end. She described their brief marriage, Grace's birth, the yellow fever epidemic that destroyed her family. She did not tell Catherine about the depth of her grief, about the weeks when she wanted to die, about the deliberate choice to become someone else. She did not tell her about the nights when she still woke up reaching for Daniel's warmth beside her, or the times when she saw a small child and felt Grace's weight phantom heavy in her arms. She did not tell her about the rage that sometimes consumed her, rage at a God who would give her freedom and family in the same breath and then snatch them away. Instead, she presented a story of resilient survival, of Christian faith tested and maintained, of a woman who had suffered loss but found purpose in caring for other people's children. It was a story white people could accept, even admire, because it confirmed their beliefs about black people's capacity for loyalty, service, and grateful submission to God's mysterious plan. Catherine listened with apparent sympathy, occasionally asking questions, nodding at appropriate moments. When Margaret finished, Catherine reached out and patted her hand, a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt patronizing. "How strong you've been, Margaret. How brave. And how wonderful that you've found a place here with us, that you've been able to use your loss to bring joy to my children. I'm sure your daughter would be proud." Margaret accepted the compliment with a nod, though internally she bridled at the presumption. Catherine had no idea what Grace would feel, no right to invoke her daughter's imagined approval. But she kept her expression neutral, her voice steady. "Thank you. I've been blessed to serve your family." The conversation ended soon after, and Margaret returned to her duties. But something had shifted in the house. The revelation of her past had changed how the Ashfords saw her, no longer just a capable servant, but a woman with a tragic history, a figure of pathos and pity. In the following days, Catherine was kinder to her, more solicitous of her comfort. Elizabeth asked occasional questions about Charleston, about what freedom had been like in those early days. Even Thomas, usually distant and formal, thanked her more often for small services. Margaret understood what was happening. Her story had made her more human to them, more sympathetic, but it had also reinforced their belief in their own benevolence. Look how they had given employment to a woman who had lost everything. Look how they had provided her with security and purpose. Look how they had made her practically family. But the story she had told them was incomplete. The real story, the story of Sarah Jenkins, of love and loss and rage and survival, remained locked in the gold necklace beneath her collar. That story was hers alone, protected and private, a secret self that no amount of white curiosity or sympathy could touch. Late that night, alone in her room, Margaret opened the locket and studied the photograph as she had done countless times before. Sarah and Grace looked back at her, frozen in that moment of captured happiness, before fever and death, before grief and reinvention. "I didn't betray you," she whispered to the image. "I told them what they needed to know, but not the truth. Not the whole truth." The photograph offered no response, but Margaret felt a sense of peace anyway. She had navigated another dangerous moment, had protected her inner self while satisfying external demands. It was exhausting work, this constant performance, this perpetual management of how she appeared to white people. But it was work she had learned to do well, work that kept her safe and employed, work that allowed her to survive in a world that offered black people few alternatives. She closed the locket and fastened the necklace around her neck, where it would remain, hidden and safe, carrying its secret story into tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. Winter came to Richmond, bringing cold rains and early darkness that made the Ashford mansion feel both cozier and more oppressive. Margaret moved through her days with practiced efficiency, maintaining the routines that had defined her life for nearly 2 decades. But something had changed since the portrait session, since Catherine's questions, since her past had been partially revealed and then repackaged into a story the Ashfords could accept. She found herself thinking more about Grace and Daniel, allowing memories she had tried to contain to surface during quiet moments. Sometimes, while folding laundry or preparing vegetables in the kitchen, she would remember Daniel's hands, how strong they were, how gentle, or Grace's laugh, which had been surprisingly deep and joyful for such a small child. These memories brought pain, but also a strange comfort, a reminder that Sarah Jenkins had existed, had loved, had mattered. In January 1904, tragedy struck the Ashford family. Edmund Ashford, who had been suffering from heart problems for several months, died suddenly in his sleep. The household plunged into mourning, draped in black crepe, silent and somber. Margaret took over many of Catherine's daily duties, managing the house while Catherine grieved, accepting condolence visits from Richmond society, and making arrangements for the funeral and burial. During this period of upheaval, Margaret saw Catherine at her most vulnerable. The composed society matron disappeared, replaced by a grieving widow who wept openly, who couldn't sleep, who wandered the house at night like a ghost haunting her own life. Margaret sat with her during those long nights, brought her tea and warm milk, listened when she needed to talk about Edmund, their courtship, their early marriage, the disappointments and joys of their life together. One night, Perhaps 3 weeks after Edmund's death, Catherine looked at Margaret with exhausted, red-rimmed eyes and said, "How did you bear it? Losing your husband and child? How did you go on?" It was the most direct, most honest question Catherine had ever asked her. Margaret considered lying, offering platitudes about faith and God's plan. But something in Catherine's expression, raw and desperate and genuinely searching, made her decide to offer truth instead. "I didn't go on, ma'am. Not at first. I wanted to die, and I almost did. I stopped eating, stopped caring. For weeks, maybe months, I was just waiting to join them." Catherine stared at her. "What changed?" "Nothing changed. I just kept waking up, kept breathing, kept existing. Eventually, I realized I had a choice. I could die slowly, or I could decide to live. So I chose to live. I became someone else, someone who could function, someone who could work and survive. I left Sarah Jenkins in Charleston and became Margaret Hayes." "But didn't you want to keep their memory alive? Didn't you want to honor them?" Margaret touched the necklace beneath her collar. "I carry them with me every day. In here. They're part of me always. But I couldn't live as a grieving widow and mother forever. I had to find a way to be useful, to have purpose. Your children gave me that purpose, ma'am. Caring for them, watching them grow, it didn't replace grace, but it gave me a reason to get up in the morning." Catherine was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire burning low in the grate. "I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I can become someone else." "You don't have to become someone else, ma'am. You have your children, your home, your place in society. You have supports that I never had. But you do have to choose, every day, you have to choose to keep living, to keep moving forward. The grief doesn't go away, but you learn to carry it." It was perhaps the most honest conversation Margaret had ever had with Catherine, a moment of genuine connection across the vast gulf that separated their experiences. For a brief time, they were just two women who had loved and lost, sharing the universal language of grief. The funeral was elaborate, attended by Richmond's elite, attorneys and businessmen, politicians and society matrons, all dressed in black and offering rehearsed condolences. Margaret worked behind the scenes, managing the refreshments, ensuring everything ran smoothly, invisible as always except when someone needed something. But during the service itself, as the minister droned on about Edmund's virtues and accomplishments, Margaret sat in the back of the church with the other servants and thought about Daniel's funeral. There had been no elaborate service for him, no important people offering condolences, no lengthy eulogies about his contributions to society. Just a simple burial in the colored cemetery, attended by a handful of formerly enslaved people who had become friends during their brief time of freedom. The minister had been a freedman himself, barely literate, reading haltingly from a Bible with torn pages. But Daniel had been mourned genuinely, by people who knew him and loved him. His loss had mattered to them in a way that Edmund's death mattered to Richmond society, because relationships mattered, because kindness mattered, because the simple fact of his existence had made their lives better. Margaret realized that in this way, Daniel's funeral had been more honest, more meaningful, than this grand spectacle where people who barely knew Edmund performed grief out of social obligation. After the funeral, Catherine asked Margaret to help her go through Edmund's belongings, his clothes, his papers, his personal effects. It was intimate work, sorting through the material evidence of a life, deciding what to keep and what to discard. Margaret handled each item carefully, conscious that she was touching objects that had meant something to someone, that carried memories and significance that would be lost when they were given away or thrown out. In Edmund's desk, they found letters, legal documents, business correspondence. But they also found more personal items, a pressed flower from Catherine's wedding bouquet, ticket stubs from a theatrical performance they had attended in their youth, a lock of hair from each of their children when they were babies, carefully labeled and tied with ribbon. Margaret watched Catherine hold these small treasures, saw her tears fall onto the faded flower petals, and understood something profound. Grief was universal, but so was love. White people and black people, wealthy and poor, enslaved and free, all of them loved, all of them lost, all of them tried to hold on to evidence of what mattered, to preserve memory against the relentless erosion of time. "Keep the things that matter to you," Margaret advised gently. The things that help you remember the good parts. Everything else can go. Catherine looked up at her. Is that what you did? With your husband's things? I didn't have much to keep. We had so little time together, so few possessions. But I kept the necklace and the photograph and the lock of Grace's hair. Those things are enough. They remind me who I was, who they were, what we meant to each other. Catherine nodded slowly. I think I understand now why you wear that necklace every day. It's not just jewelry, it's evidence. Proof that they existed, that you loved them, that it all mattered. Yes, ma'am. Exactly that. Over the following months, as Catherine adjusted to widowhood and the family restructured itself around Edmund's absence, Margaret noticed a subtle shift in their relationship. Catherine sought her advice more often, not just about household matters but about personal decisions. She asked Margaret's opinion on whether Elizabeth's wedding should be postponed due to mourning, whether Thomas should take over Edmund's law practice immediately or wait a year, whether she should sell the house or stay in Richmond. Margaret offered her thoughts carefully, always conscious of the power imbalance that underlay even their most intimate conversations. She was still a servant, still dependent on Catherine's goodwill for her livelihood and security. But there was something new in how Catherine listened to her, a respect that hadn't been there before, an acknowledgement that Margaret's experiences, her losses and survival, had given her a kind of wisdom that transcended social position. In March, the photograph from the portrait session was hung in the drawing room in an ornate gold frame. It joined the other family portraits on the wall, 3 generations of Ashfords staring out from their frames, documenting the family's history and prosperity. Margaret stood in front of it one afternoon when the family was out, studying her own image. There she was, smiling and serene, the necklace just visible at her throat. To anyone looking at the photograph, she was simply the nanny, the faithful servant, included in the family portrait as evidence of the Ashfords' benevolence. But Margaret knew better. The necklace told a different story, her story, Sarah's story, the story of love and loss and survival that no photograph could fully capture. Every time someone looked at that portrait, they would see Margaret Hayes, dutiful nanny. But the necklace whispered a truth they couldn't hear. I was someone before this. I loved before this. I lost before this. I survived. Young James found her standing there and came to join her. At 21, he was the most thoughtful of the Ashford children, the one who still sometimes sought out Margaret's company, who asked her about her life rather than just demanding her service. It's a good photograph, he said, studying it alongside her. You look happy. I'm smiling at least, Margaret replied. Is that different from being happy? Margaret considered the question. Sometimes. Sometimes people smile because they're supposed to, because it's expected. Sometimes the smile is real, and sometimes it's just good manners. James pointed at the necklace in the photograph. Mother told me about your husband and daughter. I'm sorry you lost them. Thank you, Mr. James. Do you think about them still? Every day. They're part of me. The necklace helps me remember, helps me keep them close. She paused, then decided to risk honesty. Your mother asked me how I went on after losing them. The truth is, I didn't go on. I became someone else. Margaret Hayes didn't exist before 1883. I was Sarah Jenkins, and when Sarah couldn't survive her grief, Margaret was born to take her place. James looked at her with an intensity that reminded her of the small boy he had been, always asking questions, always trying to understand how the world worked. Do you regret it? Becoming someone else? No. It was necessary. But sometimes I think about Sarah, about who she might have become if Daniel and Grace had lived. That's a person I'll never know, a life I'll never live. The necklace is all that's left of her. I think you're still her, James said quietly. Not someone else, just Sarah living in a different way, carrying her story with her. The necklace proves it. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. That's kind of you to say, Mr. James. I mean it. And someday, when I have children, I want them to know about you, not just as their nanny, but as a person with your own story, your own losses and victories. I want them to understand that you mattered beyond what you did for us. It was perhaps the greatest gift anyone in the Ashford family had ever given her, The promise that her story would be remembered, that Sarah Jenkins and Margaret Hayes would both be honored, that the necklace's secret would be known and valued. That night, in her small room under the eaves, Margaret opened the locket and studied the faded photograph as she had done thousands of times before. But this time, she didn't feel the usual weight of grief and loss. Instead, she felt something closer to peace. Her story had been told, at least partially. Someone had listened, had understood, had promised to remember. She thought about the portrait hanging in the drawing room, about the smile she had given the camera, about the necklace visible at her throat. Future generations would look at that photograph and see a black nanny in a white family's portrait, a familiar arrangement that reinforced expected social hierarchies. But they would also see the necklace, if they looked closely enough, if someone like James told them to look. And if they asked about the necklace, if they were curious enough to wonder about its story, then maybe they would learn that Margaret Hayes was also Sarah Jenkins, that she had loved and lost and survived, that she had lived multiple lives in one body, that she was more than the single dimension that society tried to reduce her to. The necklace would tell her story, would be the evidence that she had existed beyond her service, beyond her smile, beyond the comfortable narratives that white people constructed about black lives. It would be proof that she had mattered, that her love had been real, that her grief had been profound, that her survival had required courage and strength and a daily choice to keep living despite everything. In 1903, a black nanny smiled for a portrait. But the necklace on her neck told another story. A story of freedom and loss, of love that transcended death, of a woman who carried two names and two lives, of a mother who never stopped mourning her child, of a wife who wore her husband's gift every day for nearly 4 decades. It was a story hidden in plain sight, visible to anyone who cared to look, asking to be seen and understood. Margaret closed the locket and fastened the necklace around her neck, where it would remain, carrying its secret truth into morning. Outside, Richmond slept under a winter sky, unaware and indifferent. But in her small room, Margaret sat with her memories and her necklace and her 2 names, finally at peace with the story she carried, finally able to believe that it mattered, that she mattered, that Sarah and Margaret and Grace and Daniel all mattered in ways that would echo forward into time, preserved in gold and memory and the promise of a young man who had listened and understood. The photograph would hang on the Ashford wall for generations, and the necklace would remain visible in it, a small golden line against dark skin, waiting for someone to ask the question, "What is that necklace?" And when they asked, someone would tell them, "Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you about a woman who lived 2 lives, who loved and lost and survived. Let me tell you about the necklace and what it meant and why it mattered. Let me tell you about Sarah. Let me tell you about Margaret. Let me tell you about the smile and what lay beneath it. Let me tell you the truth."